6. Direct duty views. Unlike the views examined in the previous chapter, those examined in the present one recognize at least some direct duties to moral patients, and thus are not open to the objection of moral arbitrariness fatal to all versions of indirect duty views. Like these latter views, however, direct duty views openly espouse or imply that we can provide an adequate account of our duties regarding moral patients without appealing to their rights. To demonstrate the inadequacy of direct duty views is therefore necessary as a preliminary to making the case for the rights of moral patients. As was true in the previous examination of indirect duty views, not all direct duty views can be examined, but as in that previous case, those considered are the strongest, not the weakest. 2 views will be examined: 1, act utilitarianism, and 2, a position that attempts to account for our duties regarding animals by prohibiting cruelty and enjoining kindness. This latter position has no commonly accepted name, but it will be useful to give it one. Let us refer to it as the cruelty-kindness view. The defects of this view will be exposed first. 6.1. The cruelty-kindness view. Especially among those affiliated with organizations that labor for the better treatment of animals, the position is often expressed that we ought not to be cruel to animals, and ought, rather, to be kind to them. Those who express this view are not committed to believing, as, for example, Kant does, that the reason why we ought to be the one and ought not to be the other lies in the effects such treatment will have on how we treat human beings. Proponents of this view may, and in most cases do, believe that these are duties we owe directly to animals, the prohibition against cruelty encapsulating our negative duties to animals, how they are not to be treated, and the injunction to be kind encapsulating our positive duties in their case, how they are to be treated. It is only when understood in this way that the cruelty-kindness view will concern us. It is unclear whether those who subscribe to this view would be willing to generalize it to include our treatment of human moral patients, like animals in the relevant respects. But it is difficult to see how they could avoid this without being arbitrary. If it is because animals are moral patients, and not because they are animals, that we have the duties against cruelty and for kindness in their case, then we should also have these same duties directly to human moral patients. Granted, we may have other duties to human moral patients, such as the duty to provide children with opportunities for an education. But however many other duties we may or may not have to human moral patients, it is reasonable to assume that we have some of the same duties in their case as we have in the case of animals, and that, among these common duties, those who advocate the cruelty-kindness view would recognize the 2 duties at hand. For the purposes of the discussion below, however, it is not essential that an advocate of this view recognize any of the same direct duties in the case of human moral patients as, on this view, are owed to animals. It is enough that those who advocate this view believe that A, we have negative and positive duties directly to animals, and B, these direct duties can be adequately accounted for, respectively, by reference to the prohibition against cruelty and to the injunction to be kind. This view, for reasons that will become apparent as we proceed, fails to provide a satisfactory basis either for our negative or for our positive duties to animals. This can be shown by first exposing the deficiencies of the prohibition against cruelty in this regard. Cruelty. It would be difficult to find anyone who is in favor of cruelty, and when individuals and organizations champion the cause of animal welfare by denouncing cruelty to animals, they strike a responsive moral chord. Theoretically, however, our negative duties to animals are not adequately grounded if we rest them on the prohibition against cruelty. This becomes clear once we become clearer about the idea of cruelty itself. Cruelty is manifested in different ways. People can rightly be judged cruel either for what they do or for what they fail to do, and either for what they feel or what they fail to feel. The central case of cruelty appears to be the case where, in Locke's apt phrase, one takes a seeming kind of pleasure in causing another to suffer. Footnote. Locke writes as follows: "One thing I have frequently observed in children, that when they have got possession of any poor creature, they are apt to use it ill. They often torment and treat very roughly young birds, butterflies, and such other poor animals which fall into their hands, and that with a seeming kind of pleasure. This I think should be watched in them, and if they incline to any such cruelty, they should be taught the contrary usage. For the custom of tormenting and killing beasts will, by degrees, harden their minds even towards men, and they who delight in the suffering and destruction of inferior creatures will not be apt to be very compassionate or benign to those of their own kind." End footnote. Sadistic torturers provide perhaps the clearest example of cruelty in this sense. They are cruel not just because they cause suffering, so do dentists and doctors, for example, but because they enjoy doing so. Let us term this sadistic cruelty. Not all cruel people are cruel in this sense. Some cruel people do not feel pleasure in making others suffer. Indeed, they do not seem to feel anything. Their cruelty is manifested by a lack of what is judged appropriate feeling, as pity or mercy for the plight of the individual whose suffering they cause, rather than pleasure in causing it. They are, as we say, insensitive to the suffering they inflict, unmoved by it, as if they were unaware of it or failed to appreciate it as suffering, in the way that, for example, lions appear to be unaware of, and thus are not sensitive to, the pain they cause their prey. Indeed, precisely because one expects indifference from animals, but pity or mercy from human beings, people who are cruel by being insensitive to the suffering they cause often are called animals or brutes, and their character or behavior brutal or inhuman. Thus, for example, particularly ghastly murders are said to be the work of animals, the implication being that these are acts that no one moved by the human feelings of pity or mercy could bring themselves to perform. The sense of cruelty that involves indifference to, rather than enjoyment of, suffering caused to others, we shall call brutal cruelty. Cruelty of either kind, sadistic or brutal, can be manifested in active or passive behavior. Passive behavior includes acts of omission and negligence, active, acts of commission. A man who, without provocation, beats a dog into unconsciousness is actively cruel, whereas one who, through negligence, fails to feed his dog to the point where the dog's health is impoverished is passively cruel, not because of what he does, but because of what he fails to do. Both active and passive cruelty have fuzzy borders. For example, a woman is not cruel if she occasionally fails to feed her cat. She is cruel if she fails to do so most of the time. But while there is no exact number of times, no fixed percentage, such that once it is realized cruelty is present, otherwise not, there are paradigms nonetheless. We have then at least two kinds of cruelty, or two senses of the word cruelty, and two different ways in which cruelty can be manifested. Theoretically, therefore, cruelty admits of at least four possible classifications. 1. Active sadistic cruelty. 2. Passive sadistic cruelty. 3. Active brutal cruelty. And 4. Passive brutal cruelty. Let us grant that all varieties of cruelty ought to be condemned and discouraged. The question that remains is, granting this, does anti-cruelty in any or all of its forms provide an adequate basis for our negative duties to animals? It does not. For cruelty in all of its forms necessarily involves reference to an individual's mental state, namely whether one takes pleasure in causing or allowing another to suffer, or whether one is indifferent to doing this. Thus, if anti-cruelty were advanced as a basis for our negative duties to animals, it would follow that we fulfill our negative duties to them so long as we are not cruel to them. That is, so long as we do not enjoy or are not indifferent to causing or allowing them to suffer. This is manifestly inadequate. How one feels about what one does is logically distinct from the moral assessment of what one does. More particularly, how one feels about the suffering one causes an animal is logically distinct from whether it is wrong to make the animals suffer. To make animals suffer is not justified just on the grounds that one is not indifferent to their suffering, or just on the grounds that one does not enjoy making them suffer. In other words, to make animals suffer is not justified just on the grounds that the one who makes them suffer is not cruel, in any or all of cruelty's various forms. So while we can agree that cruelty is to be condemned and ought to be discouraged, we must not agree that the prohibition against cruelty provides a satisfactory basis for our negative duties to animals. Kindness. Kindness, perhaps, is an idea second only to cruelty in terms of its currency in discussions about our treatment of animals. Be kind to animals, we are enjoined, and few, if any, would take exception to the spirit of this injunction. But, like the prohibition against cruelty, the prescription to be kind will not bear the weight some people want to place on it. It simply will not do the job of grounding our positive duties to animals. Like cruel, kind and its cognates are terms of moral appraisal we use to assess and describe a person's acts or character. A kind person is one who is inclined, or disposed, to act with the intention of forwarding the interests of others, not for reasons of self-gain, but out of love, affection, or compassion for the individual whose interests are forwarded. Kind people, in a word, are not selfish, not ones who act to forward the interests of another only if or so long as doing so forwards their own interests. What, then, does the injunction to be kind to animals mean? It means either that, when it comes to this or that individual act, we are to treat animals in such a way that our intention is to forward their interests, not from a selfish motive but out of love, affection, or compassion for them, or that we are to cultivate, through such individual actions, the disposition to treat animals in this way for these reasons. And there is no denying the moral worth of the ideal that the injunction to be kind, interpreted in either of these ways, places before us. And yet, for reasons in some cases not unlike those given against the view that the prohibition against cruelty can satisfactorily serve as the basis for our negative duties to animals, the injunction to treat animals kindly fails to provide us with a satisfactory basis for our positive duties. First, kindness, like cruelty, has conceptual connections with the mind of the agent, namely, with the agent's motives and intentions. And this invites the same observation in the case of kindness as was apposite in the earlier case of cruelty. The morality of what persons do, the rightness or wrongness of their actions, is logically distinct from and should not be confused with their mental states, including the motives or intentions from which their acts proceed. While those who act kindly deserve our moral admiration, they deserve this not because they thereby do what is right. Possibly they do, but possibly they do not. They deserve this because they exhibit their goodness as people. So, just as the evil that cruelty is must be kept distinct from judging a cruel act wrong, the good that kindness is must be kept distinct from judging a kind act right. Second, the injunction to be kind to animals must fail to capture or account for the idea that we owe it to animals to treat them in certain ways, that treating them thus and so is something that is due to them. The injunction in question cannot capture or account for this because kindness is not something we owe to anybody. It's not anyone's due. To be the beneficiary of a kind act, no doubt, generally is to be blessed, but no one has a claim on anyone else's kindness. Kindness is not justice, and to the extent that animals are owed just treatment, we cannot look to the injunction that we be kind to animals as a principle that accounts, or even helps to account, for this dimension of our duties to animals. For these reasons, then, the injunction to be kind to animals, like the prohibition not to be cruel to them, cannot serve as a principle on which to rest our direct duties to animals. There is a lesson to be learned from the cruelty-kindness view's failure to provide an adequate basis for our duties to animals. No view can provide an adequate account of these duties if it requires that we make reference to the mind of the agent, to either the agent's motives or intentions. Whatever else might be said about the second view to be considered in this chapter, utilitarianism, it at least cannot be faulted for this reason. To speak of the view known as utilitarianism, as we know from the earlier sketch of utilitarian theory, is to speak somewhat loosely. Utilitarians all agree that consequences and consequences alone determine the morality of what we do, and they all agree that it is the best consequences for everyone affected by the outcome that we should aim to bring about. But not all utilitarians agree on what makes some consequences better than others, or on whether the principle of utility should be directly applied to individual actions or used to validate rules. In order to make my examination more orderly, I will begin by considering the position of the hedonistic utilitarians, Bentham and Mill. Later in this chapter, I will discuss a contemporary alternative to this view, the preference utilitarianism advanced by Peter Singer. Though it is not always clear whether the utilitarians in question should be interpreted as act utilitarians or rule utilitarians, I shall limit the examination to the former throughout the present chapter. Whenever the word utilitarianism and its cognates occur, therefore, this should be understood as an abbreviation for act utilitarianism and its cognates. Rule utilitarianism will be examined in the following chapter. 6.2. Hedonistic Utilitarianism. The classic utilitarians are hedonists. They hold that pleasure and pleasure alone is intrinsically good, and pain alone intrinsically evil. To determine what the best consequences would be in any given case, they think, we must determine which alternative available to us will bring about the optimum balance of pleasure over pain for everyone affected by the outcome. If there is some one alternative that will do this, that is the one we have a duty to select. If there are two options that will produce equally good results, and none that will produce any better, then it does not matter which of the two we choose, only that we morally ought to choose one of them. What we must never do, what is always wrong, is to select an option that will bring about less than the optimal balance of pleasure over pain. To speak of the optimal balance of pleasure over pain for everyone affected by the outcome illustrates the aggregative nature of all forms of utilitarianism. Instead of asking what will bring about the best results for me personally, which is what I should ask given rational egoism, I must ask what will bring about the best results for everyone involved, and selecting an option that brings about the best aggregative results for everyone might not be the same as selecting the option that brings about the best results for me personally. This point can be illustrated by means of the following abstract example. Here and throughout the discussion that follows, so-called total utilitarianism is at issue. To discuss other forms, for example, so-called average utilitarianism, would be to complicate the argument unnecessarily. Suppose we assign a plus score to pleasures and a minus score to pains. Suppose there are 4 individuals who will be affected by what is done: black, white, yellow, and red. Suppose that white is the individual who must decide what to do, facing a choice between 2 alternatives, A1 and A2. And suppose the consequences of his selecting A1 and A2 are, respectively, as follows. Consequences of selecting A1. For black, pleasures plus 5, pains minus 20, net per individual minus 15. For white, pleasures plus 30, pains minus 10, net per individual plus 20. For yellow, pleasures plus 5, pains minus 20, net per individual minus 15. For red, pleasures plus 5, pains minus 20, net per individual minus 15. Consequences of selecting A2. For black, pleasures plus 15, pains minus 10, net per individual plus 5. For white, pleasures plus 10, pains minus 15, net per individual minus 5. For yellow, pleasures plus 20, pains minus 25, net per individual minus 5. For red, pleasures plus 20, pains minus 25, net per individual minus 5. The consequences for white would clearly be better if he chose A1 than if he chose A2, plus 20 if A1 is chosen, minus 5 if A2 is. But that is not the alternative white should choose, given hedonistic utilitarianism. What every moral agent must do is choose that option, if there is one, that will bring about the best aggregative results, the optimal balance of pleasure over pain, for everyone affected by the outcome. And that would require that white opt for A2, as can be seen by totaling the pluses and minuses, not only for white alone, but for the 4 individuals involved. A1 yields a total of plus 20 and negative 45 for a net of negative 25. A2 yields a total of plus 5 and minus 15 for a net of minus 10. A better aggregative balance of pleasure and pain is thus obtained by choosing A2, even though white would personally be better off if he chose A1. What white morally ought to do then is A2. He may not want to do it. He may dislike doing it. He may complain. But no one ever said doing what morality requires is always easy, and it is no objection to hedonistic or other forms of utilitarianism to note that they can require that we ought to do something we don't want to do. Morally, it is the best aggregative balance we must aim to achieve, not what's best for us personally. Hedonistic utilitarianism must seem a congenial position to anyone who thinks we have some direct duties to animals. After all, the pleasures and pains of everyone affected by the outcome of what we do must be taken into account. The position will not allow us to consider the pleasures or pains of some, for example, our friends or fellow citizens, and ignore the pleasures and pains of others, for example, strangers or foreigners. Everyone's pains and pleasures count, a position that, given the reasonableness of viewing animals as having pleasant and painful sensations, implies that their pleasures and pains count too. Moreover, impartiality requires that we make similar judgments about relevantly similar cases. If it ever is true that the pains and pleasures of animals are relevantly similar to those of moral agents, then we must count the value of the animal's pleasures and pains as being equal to that of moral agents' pleasures and pains, since in some cases, most notably the case of acute physical suffering, what is experienced by animals and moral agents is relevantly similar. The value or disvalue of what they experience must not only be counted, but counted equally. A strong egalitarianism, one that knows no species boundaries, characterizes hedonistic utilitarianism. In Bentham's famous words, each to count for one, no one for more than one. From the point of view of hedonistic utilitarianism, animals have a vote in the moral affairs of the world equal to the vote of moral agents, when the pleasures or pains of both are equal. Paradigmatic speciesism, latent in Kant's view perhaps, has no foothold in this version of utilitarianism. All sentient creatures, whether humans or animals, are members of the moral community and are all directly owed some of the same duties. Much to their lasting credit, the classical utilitarians champion the cause of animal welfare, something for which all who work for the improved treatment of animals are indebted. Despite their salutary efforts, however, and notwithstanding the initial attractiveness of their egalitarian enfranchisement of animals into the moral community, hedonistic utilitarianism faces insuperable objections, and it is a good thing that it does. For though on its surface this version of utilitarianism seems to provide more than enough protection for the welfare of animals and those human moral patients like animals in the relevant respects, appearances are deceiving. Hedonistic utilitarianism has the appearance of the long-awaited draft of truth only because of the arid landscape animals occupy given indirect duty views. Once we look closely into the cup it offers, we will think twice before we drink. Killing moral agents. I will begin this assessment by first considering the implications for moral agents of hedonistic utilitarianism. We have a prima facie direct duty not to harm moral agents, including not to kill them. This is a position defended in the previous chapter. Any adequate ethical theory must be able to account for the strictness of this duty. Hedonistic utilitarianism cannot. The argument that shows this follows. How must the hedonistic utilitarian approach questions about the morality of killing moral agents? The pleasures and pains of the victim must be considered, certainly, including the foreseeable pleasures and pains he would have had he not been killed. But the victim's pleasures and pains carry no more moral weight than the equal pleasures and pains of anyone else. To count his pleasures or pains more heavily is ruled out by the egalitarianism claimed as one of the virtues of classical utilitarianism. Since each is to count for one, no one for more than one, the victim cannot have more than one vote, so to speak, in the determination of whether it would be wrong to kill him. Provided that, by killing the agent in question, the optimal aggregate balance of pleasure over pain is secured, the hedonistic utilitarian not only cannot find any moral fault with the killing, his theory positively requires that it be done. Such a result clashes with our reflective intuitions about the wrongness of killing. Killing a moral agent is so grievous a moral wrong, we think, that it can only be justified under very special circumstances, for example, self-defense. The hedonistic utilitarian's position makes killing too easy to justify. It is not only in exceptional circumstances that killing is permissible, quite ordinary circumstances would allow it. Hedonistic utilitarians are not unaware that their theory seems to run grossly counter to bedrock moral beliefs, and it is a mark of the seriousness with which they themselves view this problem that they advance arguments which, if nothing else, are ingenious in their attempt to save this theory. Their principal argument is as follows. As moral agents, we have a sense of our own mortality. We understand that we are not destined for eternal life, not on this planet at least, and we sometimes worry about this, which is the occasion for some unpleasant or painful mental perturbations. The knowledge we have that moral agents sometimes kill other moral agents is one of the things that contributes to our anxiety about our own death. This knowledge causes insecurity in our dealings with others, and this insecurity is detrimental to the hedonistic utilitarian's objective of producing the best balance of pleasure over pain for all concerned. To assess the morality of killing, therefore, we need to take into account more than just the pleasures and pains of those directly involved, the killer and the victim. We also need to take into account the worry, anxiety, and insecurity caused others who live with the knowledge that the killing has occurred. Once we do this, the hedonistic utilitarian argues, we recognize that killing is wrong when it is, largely because of its side effects, because of the anxiety and other unpleasantness caused the survivors who learn of the incident. Paradoxically, that is, the principal reason why killing moral agents is wrong is not because of the harm done to the victims. Primarily, it is because of the harm done to the survivors. This reply cannot carry the weight hedonistic utilitarians place on it. Its deficiencies can be highlighted by considering killings done in secrecy. A successful secret killing cannot cause the side effects that figure so prominently in the hedonistic utilitarian's account of the wrongness of killing. Given that the murder is committed in secrecy, the general public has no knowledge of it and so cannot lose sleep over its occurrence. If we imagine that an undetected murder did bring about the optimal balance of pleasure over pain for those affected by its outcome, then the hedonistic utilitarian could have no moral grounds to object to it. Indeed, his theory justifies it. This result also clashes with our reflective intuitions about the wrongness of killing. The secrecy of a murder makes no moral difference to its wrongness, or if it makes any difference, it actually compounds the wrong rather than diminishing it. Since those who murder in secrecy deserve to be punished for their offense, And since, because of the secrecy of their act, they never are detected or punished, justice is not done in their case, and this adds to the moral offensiveness of what they do. Hedonistic utilitarianism thus fails on two counts, failing to account both for the wrong done by secret killings and for the wrong attaching to the unknown criminals escaping punishment. Because hedonistic utilitarians themselves attempt to show how their theory can illuminate our intuitions about the wrongness of killing, appeals to these intuitions in assessing the adequacy of their theory, even if such appeals could not be independently justified, are entirely appropriate. Killing moral patience. The failure of the hedonistic utilitarians' account of the wrongness of killing moral agents is an important failure for those who believe that serious moral questions also arise in the case of killing moral patients. If the hedonistic utilitarians' account was adequate in the case of killing moral agents, it would be difficult to avoid the implication that it provides a satisfactory account of the morality of killing moral patients, and that would be an unwelcome result for those who want a firm basis for objecting to killing these latter individuals. For consider, if the morality of killing were properly assessed in terms of how much mental anguish the killing of some individuals causes others, then the door would be open to a lot of killing of moral patients, both humans and animals, especially if this is done painlessly. Bentham sees this implication of hedonistic utilitarianism clearly in the case of animals, when he writes that the death they, that is, animals, suffer in our hands commonly is, and always may be, speedier, and by that means a less painful one, than that which awaits them in the inevitable course of nature. But animals are not the only moral patients of whom this is true. Unloved or unwanted children, or burdensome mental incompetence of any age, could be killed humanely by appeal to the same criteria. Their painless death would be a speedier, and by that means a less painful one, than that which awaits them in the inevitable course of nature. Indeed, there is no reason why the same argument might not be extended to the humane killing of any young child, since, as Bentham recognizes, killing young children is of a nature not to give the slightest inquietude to the most timid imagination. Once we are old enough to comprehend the policy, as Peter Singer observes, we are too old to be threatened by it. But while the killing of human moral patients could be justified along Benthamite lines, the status of animals calls for special note. After all, since humans can have no serious worry that the employees in the nation's slaughterhouses, to use farm animals as a working example, will any day now turn to slaughtering human beings, our knowing that these animals are killed will not occasion the slightest inquietude in our breast. Moreover, by the time these animals are slaughtered, the pain caused to other animals as a result of physical separation, for example, when a bobby calf is taken from his mother, has already occurred at a time well in the past. The actual killing of these animals is therefore quite unlikely to cause any, or much, anguish or insecurity to those animals who survive. The apparent attractiveness of hedonistic utilitarianism is just that, apparent. Individuals as receptacles. If we agree that hedonistic utilitarianism makes killing too easy to justify, we may then go on to ask what there is about the position that leads to this unhappy consequence. One way of diagnosing its fundamental weakness is to note that it assumes that both moral agents and patients are, to use Singer's helpful terminology, mere receptacles of what has positive value, pleasure, or negative value, pain. They have no value of their own. What has value is what they contain, that is, what they experience. An analogy might be helpful. Suppose we think of moral agents and patients as cups into which may be poured either sweet liquids, pleasures, or bitter brews, pains. At any given time, each cup will have a certain hedonic flavor. The liquid it contains will be more or less sweet or bitter. Now, what we are to aim to bring about, according to hedonistic utilitarianism, is not the best tasting liquid for this or that particular individual. Rather, what we must aim to achieve is the best aggregated balance of the sweet and the bitter among all those individuals affected by what we do. It is the best total balance of the sweet over the bitter that we aim to realize. That being so, there is no reason why it may not be necessary to redistribute the contents of any given cup among the others, or, indeed, why it may not be necessary to destroy a given cup or receptacle quite completely. The hedonistic utilitarian cannot object to such redistribution or destruction if this is necessary to bring about the best balance of sweet over bitter, considered aggregatively for all the cups involved, assuming, as always, that the sweet and bitter liquids in all the cups have been considered and counted equitably. That is how and why hedonistic utilitarianism can sanction successful secret killings. One receptacle, one cup, is destroyed, with the result that the cups affected by the outcome obtain a better aggregative balance of the sweet, pleasure, over the bitter, pain, than was otherwise achievable. Fundamentally, then, it is how hedonistic utilitarians view individuals of direct moral concern, together with the utilitarian injunction to bring about the best consequences, that leads to unsavory moral implications. Seen in this light, it is easy to understand why someone might think that utilitarianism could avoid these implications if hedonism, and by implication, its view that individuals of direct moral concern are mere receptacles, were renounced. Just such a version of utilitarianism is advanced by Singer, whose positive position we shall now turn to consider. 6.3. Preference utilitarianism. Singer refers to his position as preference utilitarianism. On his view, those consequences we ought to aim to produce, those consequences that are the best, are those that, on balance, further the interests, that is, desires or preferences of those affected. And this, though it differs from classical utilitarianism, he states, is a form of utilitarianism. Suppose that it is. How might this form of utilitarianism be used to explain why killing is wrong? The key to the preference utilitarian account, as Singer sees this, lies in recognizing that some individuals not only prefer things here and now, they also have preferences regarding their future, in particular a preference to go on living. Since the preference utilitarian holds that an action contrary to the preferences of any being, unless this preference is outweighed by stronger contrary preferences, is wrong, it follows that killing individuals who prefer to continue living is therefore wrong, other things being equal. Unlike classic utilitarianism, Singer continues, preference utilitarianism makes killing a direct wrong done to the individual killed, because it is an act contrary to his or her preference. That the victim is not around after the act to lament the fact that his or her preferences have been disregarded is irrelevant. On Singer's view, then, whether the killing of any individual, A, is a direct wrong to A depends on whether A has the desire, prefers, to go on living. Having this particular desire, in other words, is both a necessary and a sufficient condition of killing's being a direct wrong. By making this desire a necessary condition, Singer fails to account for why we have a direct prima facie duty not to harm, by killing, animals and those human moral patients like these animals in the relevant respects. To desire to continue to live presupposes that one have a conception of one's own mortality, that one can foresee or anticipate one's eventual demise. And it presupposes, further, that having considered what one's death involves together with one's anticipated life prospects, one desires to continue to live in preference to dying. It is extremely doubtful that the moral patients at issue have the intellectual wherewithal to conceive of their own death, or to make the kind of comparative judgment Singer's view requires. That animals struggle against death, as was noted in our earlier discussion of the prima facie harm that death is insufficient evidence from which to infer that they have a conception of their own mortality, a point Singer concedes when writing of a fish's attempt to dislodge a barbed hook. He observes that the animal's struggle against danger and pain does not suggest that the fish is capable of preferring its own future existence to non-existence. But if the fish's behavior is insufficient to establish that the fish has this particular preference, how can the behavior of other animals show that they do? To argue, as we have, that how some animals behave is intelligibly described and parsimoniously explained in ways that imply that they have some preferences about their own future is one thing. To hold that they have the particular preference Singer thinks is decisive, namely the preference to go on living rather than dying, is quite another. Despite these important limitations in what animals may be reasonably viewed as preferring, Singer maintains that killing some animals is a direct wrong. Some animals, he maintains, are self-conscious or self-aware. They are aware of themselves as distinct from other entities in the world, aware that they exist over a period of time with a past and a future. Still, other animals, though they are conscious, are not self-conscious. These are claims that have been clarified and defended in earlier chapters of the present work. So Singer is so far right. When he says that killing self-conscious animals is a direct wrong done to them, however, what he says is unsupported by his analysis of the direct wrong of killing. For though self-conscious animals do have some desires that relate to their future, it is extremely unlikely that they also have a conception of their own mortality, in which case they cannot have a desire to go on living in the relevant sense. What Singer must do if he is to hold that killing self-conscious animals is a direct wrong is modify his requirement. But how? The most obvious, and for reasons offered in the earlier discussion of the prima facie harm that death is, the most reasonable modification would be as follows. A sufficient condition of killing A's being a direct wrong done to A is that continued life is in A's interests. Is, that is, a benefit to A, something that in the case of self-conscious animals makes possible the satisfaction of those desires that it is in their interests to satisfy. Modified in this way, Singer's position will imply that killing self-conscious animals is a direct wrong, even though they themselves do not desire to go on living. Singer could, it is true, continue to maintain that another sufficient condition of killings being a direct wrong is that the victim have the particular desire he singles out, namely the desire to go on living. But unless he alters his position in the way suggested, it fails to provide grounds for viewing the killing of self-conscious animals as a direct wrong. Individuals as replaceable receptacles. If Singer were to modify his position as suggested, would it then be adequate? Success here depends on whether Singer avoids the fundamental flaw of hedonistic utilitarianism, the view that individuals of direct moral concern are mere receptacles of value. Singer explicitly denies that self-conscious individuals are mere receptacles. How well he avoids the implications of hedonistic utilitarianism thus turns on the adequacy of his reasons for viewing self-conscious individuals in the way he does. So let us consider what these reasons are. Sentient but non-self-conscious beings, herefore referred to as conscious beings, Singer believes, are mere receptacles of what is good, pleasure, and evil, pain. They are cups that from moment to moment contain either the bitter, pain, or the sweet, pleasure. And to destroy them is merely to destroy something that contains, experiences, what is valuable. To illustrate the general point, imagine that a given conscious being, X, will have a total life score of plus 25 pleasure and minus 4 pain, for a net of plus 21. Imagine further that were we to kill X, we would have sufficient interest to bring another being, Y, into existence, whose total life score would be plus 21 or better. Then, were we to kill X, nothing of value would be lost, the net total of X's pleasures being equalized or bettered by the net total of Y's. It is in this sense and for these reasons that Singer regards conscious beings as replaceable receptacles of value. The status of self-conscious beings is claimed to differ. Unlike beings that are conscious but not self-conscious, beings that can properly be regarded as receptacles for experiences of pleasure and pain, rather than as individuals leading lives of their own, Singer writes. Rational self-conscious beings are individuals leading lives of their own and are not mere receptacles for containing a certain quantity of happiness. Whereas the killing of a conscious being does nothing contrary to that being's preferences. By definition, beings who are merely conscious, on Singer's view, have no preferences. To kill self-conscious beings is to do something that frustrates their preferences, and this is a prima facie wrong done directly to them, even granting that once dead they cannot fret over how their preferences have been frustrated. Because self-conscious beings have preferences about their future, they are more than receptacles. There are serious problems here. As the English philosopher H.L.A. Hart was the first to observe, Singer gives no argument to support the view that self-conscious individuals are not mere receptacles. Though having preferences is distinct from experiencing pleasure, Singer's version of utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism, implies, Hart argues, that self-conscious beings are, in a sense, mere receptacles, not indeed for experiences of pleasure and pain, but for preferences. To the extent that Singer's position really is a form of utilitarianism, that is, really does enjoin us to act so as to bring about the best consequences, the optimal aggregate balance of the satisfaction of preferences over their frustration for all concerned, then, Hart contends, there is nothing to show that such preferences evaluated for the purposes of preference utilitarianism by reference to numbers and intensity cannot be replaced by others as well as outweighed by others. To make Hart's point about replaceability clearer, imagine that a given self-conscious individual, A, would have a total life score of plus 80 for preferences satisfied and minus 15 for preferences frustrated, for a net of plus 65, were A to live out his natural life, whereas his net score would be, say, plus 50 if we killed him. Imagine further that we could bring another self-conscious being into existence whose total life score would exceed either score. Say the total would be plus 93. Other things being equal, the preference utilitarian must hold that we ought to kill A, since on that view A is replaceable by and ought to be replaced by B. Moreover, despite Singer's protestations to the contrary, self-conscious beings are, as Hart alleges, receptacles, given preference utilitarianism. Granted, one must take such a being's preferences into account and count them equitably before deciding what ought to be done. Nevertheless, there is no reason why, having done this, it might not be true that the optimal balance of satisfaction over frustration of preferences for all concerned might not be achieved by killing A. This is Hart's point when he says that, according to preference utilitarianism, preferences must be evaluated by numbers and intensity. And it is also what Singer himself implies when he writes that an action contrary to the preferences of any other being, unless this preference is outweighed by stronger contrary preferences, is wrong, other things being equal. The key phrase here is, unless this preference is outweighed by stronger contrary preferences. Whose preferences? It cannot be only the preferences of a particular individual, for example, A's preference to go on living, because utilitarianism bids us consider the preferences of everyone affected by the outcome. The contrary preferences could be the preferences of those whose preferences stand to be optimally satisfied by bringing about A's death. If, having taken everyone's preferences into account and counted them all equitably, we were to find that killing A would bring about the optimal aggregate balance of satisfaction of preferences all considered, then that is what we should do given preference utilitarianism. On that view, in short, A is only a receptacle of what has value, that is, preference satisfaction, lacking any independent value of his own. The implications of the view that self-conscious individuals are replaceable receptacles, given preference utilitarianism, are not favorable to Singer's attempt to provide a version of utilitarianism preferable to hedonistic utilitarianism. A central problem for this latter view, as we have seen, is that killing a self-conscious being would be justified if this brought about the optimal aggregate balance of pleasure over pain for those affected by the outcome, and that makes killing too easy to justify. Singer evidently wants to avoid this, and he thinks he can do so by retaining utilitarianism while scrapping hedonism. But Singer's position does not avoid this. Self-conscious individuals are just as much replaceable receptacles, given preference utilitarianism, as they are given hedonistic utilitarianism. The only difference is that they are replaceable receptacles with preferences in the former case, and replaceable receptacles with pleasures and pains in the latter. In this regard, preference utilitarianism marks no improvement over hedonistic utilitarianism. Both fail the test of conformity with our reflective moral intuitions. Singer, we know, does not believe that ethical theories should be tested by how well they conform to our intuitions, either pre-reflective or reflective. Consistent with his position, he could simply bite the bullet, so to speak, when it comes to the implications of preference utilitarianism. If we point out that, other things being equal, his position allows killing moral agents if they are replaced by others with equal preference satisfaction scores, or indeed, so long as the preferences of already existing moral agents are optimally satisfied as a result, and that we think this is wrong. Singer could reply that it is our intuitions that need changing, not his theory. Moreover, even were we to offer an argument, as we have in the preceding chapter, that moved our intuitions about the wrongness of such killing from the status of pre-reflective to reflective intuitions, Singer might still hold his ground. Singer's reasons for rejecting appeals to intuitions were considered earlier and judged deficient. However, rather than merely contest Singer's theory from a vantage point whose validity he is certain to question from the outset, it will be more productive to challenge his position from a perspective whose validity he cannot rationally contest. The perspective is that of consistency, a non-controversial minimal requirement that must be met by any ethical theory if it is to have any claim on our rational assent. Interpreted strictly, Singer's theory fails to meet this requirement. Interpreted in ways that overcome this deficiency, his theory remains unsupported. That, in brief, is the destination of the argument on which I am about to embark. Singer's dilemma. Utilitarianism frequently is attacked on the ground that it can sanction inequitable distributions of harms, evils, and benefits, goods. Since the goal set by the theory is aggregative, we are to act so as to bring about the best total balance of good over bad consequences, all considered, for everyone affected by the outcome. Critics argue that following this principle could require that some few individuals be made to suffer a lot, so that the rest might individually gain a little, the aggregated gain by the many more than compensating for the grievous losses of the few. The preceding discussion of the wrongness of killing and the problems this raises for utilitarians is a special instance of this general line of attack against utilitarianism. I shall have more to say on this score in 6.5 and 8.10. But there are other notions and principles of equality in addition to, and more basic than, those that figure in the debate over equal distribution. This latter debate concerns the justice of distributing goods and evils among various individuals, assuming that, before distributive concerns, the affected individuals have been treated equitably. It is this pre-distributive requirement of just treatment that Bentham marks by his famous declaration, each to count for one, no one for more than one. An understanding of equality, in Singer's words, that utilitarians, from Jeremy Bentham to J.J.C. Smart, take as axiomatic in deciding moral issues. In their rush to air objections based on the unsavory distributive implications of utilitarianism, utilitarianism's critics have failed to give equal time to the problem this Benthamite notion of equality poses for utilitarian theory in general, and for Singer's version of that theory in particular. What these problems are, we shall now begin to see. The Benthamite notion of equality bulks large in Singer's thought. Our first question concerns how he understands this notion. It is not factual equality. When, for example, we say that humans are equal, We do not mean that they have the same abilities, hair color, or number of arms. If this were what we meant, the declaration of equality would be patently false. Instead, the kind of equality Singer has in mind is expressed by what he refers to as the basic moral principle of equality, a principle that is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. It is a prescription of how we should treat humans, and, Singer argues, many non-human animals besides. What this principle prescribes is that the interests of every being affected by an action are to be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interests of any other being. For convenience sake, let us refer to the principle just quoted as the equality principle. That principle, then, according to Singer, is A, prescriptive, not descriptive, B, basic, C, moral, D, concerns the range of interests to be considered, the interests of every being affected by an action are to be taken into account, and E, prescribes that equal interests be counted equally. Two options are available to Singer, given his view that the equality principle is a basic moral principle. Either he may regard it as a basic moral principle in the logical sense of basic, meaning that it cannot be derived from any other moral principle, or he may regard it as basic in a non-logical sense, meaning that though it is derivable, it is of especially crucial moral importance. Footnote: I assume that the problem of the logical relationship between the principles of utility and equality can and will arise for cognitivist and non-cognitivist utilitarians alike, and thus that this problem could not be avoided by a Singer-type utilitarian who advocates a non-cognitivist meta-ethic. In assuming that non-cognitivist utilitarians can and will accept that logical relations hold between different moral prescriptions, I assume what non-cognitivist utilitarians themselves profess. End footnote. Surprisingly, some of what Singer writes strongly suggests that he inclines toward the former option, as witness the following. The only principle of equality I hold is the principle that the interests of every being affected by an action are to be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interests of any other being. Utilitarianism presupposes this principle. This last sentence commits Singer to the view that a logical relationship holds between the principles of equality and utility. When he says that utilitarianism presupposes the equality principle, he implies that unless we assume the validity of the equality principle, utilitarianism has no moral or logical footing. What the quoted passage implies, in short, is that rather than the moral principle of equality depending on that of utility, the reverse is true. The principle of utility depends on the more basic moral principle of equality. No consistent utilitarian can believe this. If utility is, as it must be for the utilitarian, and as Singer says it is, the sole moral basis of morality, then all other moral principles must be derivable from it, and it in turn cannot presuppose any other more or equally basic moral principle. For a utilitarian to argue otherwise is to render utilitarianism incoherent. Singer must, therefore, avoid the first option at all costs. The second option promises to be more attractive. Footnote: though a possible option, I know of no utilitarian who has chosen it. Certainly, Singer, much to his credit, does not. To do so would, among other things, undermine his case for animal liberation, since the utility of counting the interest animals have in avoiding pain as equal to the interest humans have in avoiding it might differ quite markedly. End footnote. If, as this option maintains, the equality principle, like all other moral principles save that of utility itself, is derivable from the principle of utility, then selecting this alternative at least permits one to advance what appears to be a coherent version of utilitarianism. But the attractiveness of this second option is illusory. The attempt to ground the equality principle in that of utility involves a gross distortion of the notion of equality as it applies to interests. The equality or inequality of the interests of two individuals, A and B, depends on how important their respective interests are to them. A's interest being equal to B's if their interests have like importance to A and B respectively, A's and B's interests being unequal if the case is otherwise. The equality or inequality of their interests cannot depend on how the interests of others will be affected if A's and B's interests are considered as equal or unequal. If this were so, we would be free to regard the same interests of A and B as equal at one time and as unequal at another, because the interests of others happen to be affected differently by regarding A's and B's interests differently at these different times. This is to make a shambles of the notion of equality as it applies to interests. And yet this is precisely where we are led in our understanding of equal interests, if the obligation to respect the equality principle is derived from the principle of utility. For the utility of counting A's and B's interests as equal can vary from case to case, even if their interests themselves do not. Thus, if utility is our guide, we are permitted to count the same interests as equal in one case and as unequal in another. This is to distort the concept of equal interests beyond recognition. The upshot of the foregoing does not bode well for a position like Singer's. The dilemma that must be faced is that of either setting forth a view of the relationship between the moral principles of utility and equality that renders utilitarianism inconsistent, the argument given against the first option, or setting forth an account of the relationship between these two principles that avoids the charge of inconsistency, but only at the price of grossly distorting the concept of equal interests, the argument given against the second option. It should be emphasized that the choice between these two alternatives cannot be avoided by a utilitarian who, like Singer, maintains that the equality principle is a moral principle, for then that principle must either be conceived to be underived, in which case the charge of inconsistency will apply, or derived, in which case the charge of distortion will prevail. In either case, therefore, the equality principle can find no home within utilitarianism if, like Singer, utilitarians view the equality principle as a moral principle. Equality as a formal principle. There is an obvious way for utilitarians, including Singer, to try to avoid this outcome. This is to regard the equality principle as a formal moral principle rather than as a substantive one. As a principle, that is, that does not itself lay down a moral obligation concerning what we ought to do, but instead sets forth a condition that must be met by any substantive moral principle that does lay down such an obligation. On this view of the equality principle, in other words, this principle incorporates at least a partial test for determining when a principle is a moral as distinct from a non-moral principle. Principles that pass this test to that extent qualify as moral principles. Those that fail it lack that status. Thus, the principle of utility qualifies, but rational egoism, at least as Narveson seems to understand it, fails to qualify as a moral principle properly conceived. To regard the equality principle as a formal moral principle does avoid the dilemma fatal to those utilitarians who, like Singer, view that principle as a substantive moral principle. The trouble for this defense of utilitarianism is that it is false that the equality principle is a formal moral principle in the sense explained. Recall that principle, 1, concerns the range of interests to be considered. The interests of every being affected by an action are to be taken into account. And 2, prescribes that equal interests be counted equally. If the equality principle is said to be a formal moral principle, then any principle that fails to comply with 1 and 2 fails to qualify as a moral principle. This is false. Kant, for example, who arguably thinks that considerations about the interests Singer has in mind, namely preference interests, are irrelevant to the determination of where our moral duty lies, may advance a defective vision of morality. But not even Kant's harshest critics will maintain that the categorical imperative does not have the status of a moral principle. Mistaken it may be, but at least it must be found to be mistaken as a moral principle. In the following chapter, a non-utilitarian moral principle, the respect principle, will be explained and defended. This principle does not meet the equality principle as this is interpreted by utilitarians. Since, then, principles that fail to comply with 1 and 2 might nonetheless be moral principles, it is false that the equality principle is a formal moral principle in the sense explained. Equality as a conditional formal principle. If the equality principle is not a formal moral principle, and if, for the reasons given in the earlier discussion of Singer's views, this principle cannot reasonably be viewed as a substantive moral principle within utilitarian theory, then what is a utilitarian to do? The Benthamite proviso, each to count for 1, no one for more than 1, allegedly axiomatic for utilitarianism, paradoxically seems not to be able to find a place within that theory. Short of abandoning utilitarianism, there remains one final alternative. This is for the utilitarian to regard the equality principle as a conditional formal principle. To say it is conditional is to say that it becomes operative only if certain conditions are met. Singer provides a clue as to what these conditions might be when he observes that each of us has a very natural concern that our own interests are to be looked after. Suppose we acknowledge this natural propensity. Then we shall surely want others to take note of our interests and weigh them equitably. That is, not to discount the importance of our interests just because they are not their interests. If my interest in X is the same as yours, then I shall want you to give the same weight to my interest as you give to yours. If you do not, then you will have lapsed back into egoism, which is tantamount to saying that you are not taking the moral point of view. For to take that point of view requires that one be willing to universalize one's judgments of value. This requirement falls to me, however, not just to others. If I place a certain value on my interest in X, I must recognize the like value of anyone's similar interest. And if I would have others take note of my interests because they are important to me, then I must take note of theirs, recognizing that they are important to them. In this way, then, we arrive at the equality principle, only now viewed as a conditional formal principle. Let us refer to this way of viewing equality as conditional equality and express this principle as follows. If I would have others consider my interests and count them equitably, and if I am to take the moral point of view, then I commit myself to considering the interests of all those affected and to counting equal interests equally. Those who, like Kant, think that an individual's preference interests are irrelevant to the determination of where our duty lies, are likely to look with disfavor even on this way of viewing the equality principle, arguing that we ought not to mix considerations about such interests with taking the moral point of view. But suppose we bypass this line of debate for the present and assume that some individual, A, not only understands but actually accepts conditional equality. That is, assume that A would have others consider his interests and weigh them equitably, that A would take the moral point of view, and that, as a consequence of both these assumptions, A does agree that he too must canvass the interests of others and count equal interests equally. Granting all this, we may then go on to ask about how A may view the principle of utility. Two options are at hand. The first is that acceptance of conditional equality is consistent with utilitarianism. This is a weak option because, on its face, it provides no reason for selecting utilitarianism in preference of other substantive views of morality that are also consistent with acceptance of conditional equality, such as Ross's view that there are many rules of prima facie duty. The second, strong option is that acceptance of the conditional equality principle logically commits one to the principle of utility. This strong option can itself take two forms. SO1, maintaining that acceptance of conditional equality commits one to accepting the principle of utility to the exclusion of any other substantive moral principle. SO2, maintaining that acceptance of conditional equality commits one to accepting utility as a minimal moral principle, while leaving open the possibility that there may be other moral principles besides that of utility that one may also consistently accept. Hare possibly accepts SO1, One must say possibly, because it is not altogether clear what Hare's considered view is in this regard. Singer, however, evidently accepts SO2, since he states the following. The utilitarian position is a minimal one, a first base which we reach by universalizing self-interested decision-making. We cannot, if we are to think ethically, refuse to take this first step. Here, Singer allows that there may be other moral principles in addition to utility, while maintaining that we must accept utility if, starting with our individual interests, we take the moral point of view. For to take that point of view, starting with our self-interest, commits us to the conditional equality principle, and this, in turn, commits us to utilitarianism. At least this appears to be both a natural and fair interpretation of the crucial argument for accepting utilitarianism in the following passage. Suppose I begin to think ethically, to the extent of recognizing that my own interests cannot count for more, simply because they are mine, than the interests of others. In place of my own interests, I now have to take account of the interests of all those affected by my decision. This requires me to weigh up these interests and adopt the course of action most likely to maximize the interests of those affected. Thus, I must choose the course of action which has the best consequences, on balance, for all affected. This is a form of utilitarianism. It differs from classical utilitarianism in that best consequences is understood as meaning what, on balance, furthers the interests of those affected, rather than merely what increases pleasure and pain. It is by means of the argument just quoted, then, that Singer evidently believes we are able to support SO2. The view, again, that acceptance of the principle of conditional equality commits one to accepting utility, at least as a minimal, though not necessarily as the only, substantive moral principle. Suppose this is true. Where have we got to? At the very most, we have arrived at a consequentialist principle. One moral principle we should recognize is that of acting in ways that, on balance, further the interests, desires, etc., of those affected. Logically, this is a far piece indeed from utilitarianism. The view that, in Singer's words, utility is the sole moral basis of morality. For all we know, and as Singer himself concedes, there might be other moral theories, distinct from utilitarianism, that could accept the consequentialist principle at which he arrives. Moreover, all that this argument could show is that if we begin to do our moral thinking from the point of view of furthering our own interests, and if we take the moral point of view, then we commit ourselves to the consequentialist principle Singer identifies. Footnote. For reasons I advance elsewhere, I do not think anyone does commit himself to this consequentialist principle, even granting we concede Singer his assumptions. Indeed, to the extent that preference utilitarianism relies on a preference theory of value, not only does Singer's consequentialist principle not follow from the reasons he gives in its support, but that principle actually is inconsistent with the preference theory of value. End footnote. What this argument fails to show is that we should begin to do our moral thinking starting with the point of view of individual self-interest. Why suppose that a moral principle we commit ourselves to, starting from this point of view, is a valid moral principle? Where is the argument that shows this? In all fairness to Singer, it must be said that he fails to give one, and that he should make good this omission. There are other places to begin our moral thinking and other principles we will reach if we begin in other ways. Kant provides us with an alternative approach and an alternative principle. A second will be advanced in the chapter that follows. The situation, then, is this. No consistent utilitarian can regard the equality principle as a moral principle, and those who are not already committed to favoring consequentialist moral principles will not accept the utilitarian's interpretation of the equality principle as a formal principle that any and all moral principles must satisfy. Moreover, even if we concede that we commit ourselves to the consequentialist principle Singer articulates, if we would have others consider our preferences and count them equitably, and if we take the moral point of view, it does not follow that we commit ourselves to utilitarianism. The view, again, that the principle of utility is the sole moral basis of morality, or that we should begin to do our ethical thinking from this point of view, or that the principle we reach if we do start in this way is a valid moral principle. For these reasons, then, preference utilitarianism, as a full-blooded version of utilitarianism, remains lacking in convincing support. Why this should be good news to those who labor for the better treatment of animals is a topic I will now begin to address. 6.4. Singer's Grounds for Vegetarianism. Throughout this chapter, I have been interpreting Singer's position as an example of a direct duty view, a position that holds that we have some direct duties to animals, but denies that they have any rights. Readers familiar with some of Singer's earlier writings on animals might think he has been misinterpreted. For example, in his well-known essay, All Animals Are Equal, Singer quotes Bentham's famous passage. The question is not, can they, that is, animals, reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Singer then comments, in this passage, Bentham points to the capacity for suffering as the vital characteristic that gives a being the right to equal consideration. Here, it might be objected against the present interpretation, Singer points to a particular capacity, namely, the capacity for suffering, or, as he says a few lines later, the capacity for suffering and or enjoyment as the basis for the right to equal consideration. No mention is made of utilitarian considerations. On the contrary, it would not be an unnatural interpretation to say that Singer thinks that certain beings have the right to equal consideration of interests because of their nature, because, as a matter of their nature, they have the capacity to suffer or to enjoy or both. Arguably, Singer could be interpreted as thinking that sentient animals have one basic moral right, the right to equal consideration of their interests. Nor is this right the only right Singer mentions. To avoid the prejudice of speciesism, we must allow that beings which are similar to humans in all relevant respects have a similar right to life. At least some animals are sufficiently similar to humans in all relevant respects. Thus, at least some animals have a right to life, Singer implies. But if we ask what those respects are by virtue of which the humans and animals in question have an equal claim to the right to life, these are the natural capacities of the beings in question, which, it might be alleged, further supports interpreting Singer as believing that at least some animals have, as all or at least most humans do, certain natural or basic rights, in this case the right to life. Natural though this interpretation appears, Singer has stated clearly that it fails to capture his considered position. In response to a critic's complaint that he has little to say about the nature of rights, Singer writes as follows. Why is it surprising that I have little to say about the nature of rights? It would only be surprising to one who assumes that my case for animal liberation is based upon rights, and in particular upon the idea of extending rights to animals. But this is not my position at all. I have little to say about rights because rights are not important to my argument. My argument is based on the principle of equality, which I do have quite a lot to say about. My basic moral position, as my emphasis on pleasure and pain and my quoting Bentham might have led readers to suspect, is utilitarian. I make very little use of the word rights in animal liberation, and I could easily have dispensed with it altogether. I think that the only right I ever attribute to animals is the right to equal consideration of interests, and anything that is expressed by talking of such a right could equally well be expressed by the assertion that animals' interests ought to be given equal consideration with the like interests of humans. With the benefit of hindsight, I regret that I did allow the concept of a right to intrude into my work so unnecessarily at this point. It would have avoided misunderstanding if I had not made this concession to popular moral rhetoric. To the charge of having embroiled the animal liberation debate in the issue of animals' rights, then, I plead not guilty. As to who the real culprit might be, this passage leaves little room for doubt as to what Singer thinks. His previous references to animal rights, he thinks, not only were unnecessary for his utilitarian position, but were lamentable, something he now regrets. a concession to popular moral rhetoric rather than a reasoned appeal. Perhaps this is so. Perhaps appeals to the rights of animals must bear the diagnosis Singer gives of his earlier work. It would be premature to make a judgment at this juncture. The positive argument for recognizing the rights of animals remains to be considered. Our present task is restricted to asking how well Singer defends his views about our duties to animals. Once this is shorn of his rhetorical excesses, the inadequacy of his utilitarian position can be illustrated by concentrating on one obligation he claims we have, namely, the obligation to be vegetarians. Once the inadequacy of his position is recognized in relation to this issue, one can easily see how it is similarly inadequate when applied to others. For example, the use of animals in science, a use of animals to which Singer also takes moral exception. Anyone writing on the topic of the treatment of animals must acknowledge an enormous debt to Singer. The growing public awareness of the gruesome details of factory farming is in no small measure due to the wide readership his work, especially Animal Liberation, has rightfully commanded. All of us by now know, or at least have had the opportunity to find out, that chickens are raised in incredibly crowded, unnatural environments, that veal calves are intentionally raised on an anemic diet, are unable to move enough even to clean themselves, and are kept in the dark most of their lives. That other animals, including pigs and cattle, are being raised intensively in increasing numbers. But this debt to Singer's work does not imply that his moral argument for vegetarianism is adequate. Here is the way he brings that argument to its moral destination. Since, as I have said, none of these practices, of raising animals intensively, cater for anything more than our pleasures of taste, our practice of rearing and killing other animals in order to eat them is a clear instance of the sacrifice of the most important interests of other beings in order to satisfy trivial interests of our own. We must stop this practice, and each of us has a moral obligation to cease supporting the practice. There are several problems here. The first concerns the grounds Singer has for judging that our pleasures of taste are trivial interests. Many people, including many quite thoughtful persons, do not regard the situation in this way. Many go to a great deal of trouble to prepare tasty food or to find the best restaurants where such food is prepared. Singer might say that people who place so much importance on the taste of food have a warped sense of values, and maybe they do. But that they do, if they do, is something that stands in need of rather elaborate argument, one not found in any of Singer's published writings. This is not to say that the interest we have in eating tasty food is as important an interest as we, or animals, have in avoiding pain or death. It is just to say that it is unclear, and that Singer has given no argument to show that our interest in eating tasty food is, in his words, trivial. Second, and now granting to Singer his assumption that our interest in eating pleasant-tasting food is trivial, it is unclear how, as a utilitarian, he can argue that we have a moral obligation to stop supporting the practice of raising animals intensively. This practice is henceforth symbolized as P, because of some statement about the purpose of P. The question the utilitarian must answer is not A, what is the purpose of P? It is B, all things considered, what are the consequences of P, and how do they compare to the value of the consequences that would result if alternatives to P were adopted and supported? When, therefore, Singer objects to P on the ground that it does not cater for anything more than our pleasures of taste, he gives us an answer to A, not, as we should expect from a utilitarian, an answer to B. The difference between the two questions and their respective answers is not unimportant, for though the purpose of P might be correctly described as that of catering to our trivial pleasures of taste, it does not follow either that this is a utilitarian objection one might raise against P. It is not. Or that when a distinctively utilitarian objection is forthcoming, it will dwell on Singer's characterization of P's purpose. His characterization also leaves out much that, from a utilitarian point of view, must be judged to be highly relevant to determining the morality of P. The animal industry is big business. It is uncertain exactly how many people are involved in it, directly or indirectly, but certainly the number must easily run into the many tens of thousands. There are, first and most obviously, those who actually raise and sell the animals. But there are many others besides, including feed producers and retailers, cage manufacturers and designers, the producers of growth stimulants and other chemicals, for example, those designed to ward off or control disease, those who butcher, package, and ship the meat or eggs or other animal products to which Singer might, and does, as in the case of eggs from battery hens, take moral exception, and the extension personnel and veterinarians whose lives revolve around the success or failure of the animal industry. Also, consider all the members of the families who are the dependents of these employees or employers. The interests these persons have in business as usual, in raising animals intensively, go well beyond pleasures of taste and are far from trivial. These people have a stake in the animal industry as rudimentary and important as having a job, feeding a family, or laying aside money for their children's education or their own retirement. What do these people do about a job, a means of supporting themselves or their dependents, if we or they see the error of their or our ways and become vegetarians? Certainly, it is no defense of an immoral practice to plead that some people profit from it. In the case of slavery, for example, we would not cease to condemn it merely because we were apprised that plantation owners found it beneficial. But Singer, we know, is disdainful of appeals to our moral intuitions, so this appeal is not available to him. In the particular case of the morality of raising animals intensively, moreover, Singer, as a preference utilitarian, cannot say that the interests of those humans involved in this practice, those whose quality of life presently is bound up in it, are irrelevant. If preference satisfaction is the yardstick of what is right and wrong, then everyone's preference satisfaction must count and be counted equitably, which means that the preferences of those involved in and supportive of the animal industry, not just those who oppose it, must find their place in the calculations. Since there are many more humans who prefer a continuation of this industry than who oppose it, it is quite unclear how the preferences of the latter can outweigh those of the former. If the preferences of farm animals are added, the situation remains cloudy at best. It is not just for trivial reasons that those humans involved in the animal industry want to see it continue and prosper. Interests important to them are at stake, and it is at just this point that the significant conservative bias of preference utilitarianism, alluded to in an earlier context, comes into view, blunting the efforts of its advocates when they call upon people to make significant changes in how they live. Preference utilitarians might think they can show that people have a duty to become vegetarians without denying the relevance of people's present dietary and other preferences in the determination of where their duty lies. But no preference utilitarian, it seems fair to say, has shown this. The difficulties faced by a preference utilitarian such as Singer actually are more complicated than the preceding suggests. Because of his version of utilitarianism, Singer must insist on the relevance of side effects, that is, the interests of everyone affected by the consequences of altering the animal industry, not just those who happen to be directly involved in it. For example, the short and long-term global economic implications of a sudden or gradual transition to vegetarianism by large numbers of persons must seriously be investigated by any utilitarian. It is not enough to point out, as vegetarians sometimes do, that grains not used to feed intensively raised animals could be used to feed the starving masses of humanity. A utilitarian must have the hard data to show that this possibility is at least probable and, judged on utilitarian grounds, desirable. The debate between Singer and Garrett Hardin over the desirability of famine relief, judged on utilitarian principles, is relevant here and points to the enormity of the task that confronts anyone who would rest vegetarianism on utilitarianism. Though the issues involved are very complicated and cannot receive anything approaching even a modest airing on this occasion, one thing is certain. It is not obviously true that the aggregated consequences for everyone affected would be better, all considered, if intensive rearing methods were abandoned and we all, or most of us, became, all at once or gradually, vegetarians. Some nice calculations are necessary to show this. Without them, a utilitarian-based vegetarianism cannot command our rational assent. Even the most sympathetic reader, even fellow travelers in the vegetarian movement, will fail to find the necessary calculations in Singer's work. They simply are not there. Singer, or a defender of his position, can be expected to protest at this point by noting that utilitarianism, as he understands it, involves acceptance of the equality of interests principle, the principle that the interests of every being affected by an action are to be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interests of any other being. We have already seen the difficulties Singer faces in finding a place for this principle in his preference utilitarianism. These difficulties haunt him here. One problem with this principle is that it does not tell us what we ought to do once we have taken the interests of all affected parties into account and counted equal interests equally. All that it tells us is that this is something we must do, even if, in addition to this principle, we are also supplied with the principle of utility. We are still some distance from the obligation to be vegetarian. For what we would have to be shown, and what Singer fails to show, as argued previously, is that the consequences of all or most persons adopting a vegetarian way of life would be better, all considered, than if they did not. That is not shown merely by insisting that equal interests are equal. A defender of Singer might object that an important argument has been overlooked. On a number of occasions, Singer argues that we would not allow to be done to human imbeciles what we allow to be done to more intelligent, more self-conscious animals. For example, we would not allow trivial, painful experiments to be conducted upon these humans, whereas we do allow them to be conducted on primates. In this and analogous ways, we are guilty of a gross form of prejudice, speciesism. We are grossly inconsistent from the moral point of view. This view of Singer's is not without considerable moral weight, but it does not strengthen his avowedly utilitarian basis for vegetarianism, or, more generally, for more humane treatment of animals. A non-utilitarian critique of speciesism is offered in 8.11. In order for this argument for moral consistency to provide a utilitarian basis for more humane treatment of animals, Singer would have to show that it would be just as wrong on utilitarian grounds to treat animals in certain ways as it is to treat humans in comparable ways. Singer, however, does not show, first, that on utilitarian grounds it would be wrong to treat humans in the ways described. Here he merely appeals to our settled conviction that it would be wrong to do this, an unusual move given his own criticisms of making such appeals. And second, that it would be just as wrong on utilitarian grounds to treat animals as these humans would be. In short, Singer fails to give a utilitarian basis, one that judges matters on known or probable consequences, for the argument he deploys to challenge speciesist practices. Nor will it do as a defense of Singer merely to assume that the equality of interests principle must be violated by the differential treatment of the humans and animals in question. That would have to be shown, not assumed, on utilitarian grounds, since there is no reason why the following is not possible. The interests of animals raised intensively are counted as equal to the interests of humans like them in the relevant respects, who might be raised as a food source under similar circumstances. But the consequences of treating the animals in this way are optimific, that is, produce the best aggregate balance of good over evil, whereas those resulting from raising these humans intensively would not be. More generally, dissimilar treatment of beings with equal interests might well have greatly varying consequences. So, even granting that we would not approve of treating these humans in the ways animals are routinely treated, and even assuming that the humans and animals themselves have an equal interest in avoiding pain and death, it does not follow that we have been given a utilitarian basis for vegetarianism or the cause of more humane treatment of animals generally. The requirement that, in certain settings, for example specific research, animals and human moral patients be treated similarly over and above counting their like interests equally, is a requirement Singer implicitly accepts but fails to justify. Singer's paradox. So far, the discussion has been limited to noting that Singer fails to provide an adequate utilitarian basis for the obligation to be a vegetarian. It now remains to show that his attempts to do so leads to a highly paradoxical consequence, one that, on reflection, dooms the enterprise from the start. In responding to various critics' accusations that being a vegetarian must be a largely symbolic gesture for the individual utilitarian, since one person's boycotting meat will fail to make any difference in the way animals are treated in factory farming, Singer replies that in the case of chickens, for example, there must be some point at which the number of vegetarians makes a difference to the size of the poultry industry. There must be a series of thresholds, hidden by the market system of distribution, which determine how many factory farms will be in existence. In this case, one more person becoming a vegetarian will make no difference at all, unless that individual, added to the others who are already vegetarians, reduces demand below the threshold level at which a new factory farm would have started up, or an existing one would have remained in production if industry is declining. Whether we now know what these thresholds are is a moot point for present purposes. The point to be stressed now is the paradoxical nature of this aspect of Singer's utilitarian basis of the obligation to be vegetarian. What it comes to is that in being a vegetarian, I am doing what I ought to do only if it happens to be true that enough other people happen also to be vegetarians, so that when the effects of their boycotting meat are joined with the efforts of my boycott, it happens to be the case that some number of chickens that would have been raised in a factory farm are spared that fate. If, on the other hand, the effects of our collective boycott happen not to make any difference in the number of chickens raised intensively, then, in being vegetarians, we are not doing what we ought to do, not because of any failing on our part, assume we work very hard to persuade others but fail to do so, but because of the effects of the decisions of others, that is, non-vegetarians, whose demand for meat more than offsets the effect of our boycott. But to make the rightness of what vegetarians do contingent upon the decisions of those very persons who are doing what vegetarians deplore, and Singer's view does imply this, is paradoxical at best, all the more so when we pause to observe that, on this view, all that non-vegetarians need do in order to ensure that they personally escape the obligation to be vegetarian, as this is determined by the vegetarian's impact on factory farming, is to continue doing precisely what it is that they are presently doing, namely, eating meat. For there is, on this view, no obligation to abstain from eating meat if too few people do abstain, so that those who do eat meat do nothing wrong. And if, perchance, the ranks of vegetarians were to swell to such an extent that their collective impact on factory farming could, other things being equal, close this or that intensive rearing operation, the non-vegetarians, given Singer's position, could still take steps to escape the obligatoriness of vegetarianism, as this is assessed by the impact of vegetarians on factory farming. All that non-vegetarians would need do is eat more meat, thereby negating the collective effect of the vegetarians, and so, on Singer's view, thereby negating the meat-eaters' obligation to be vegetarian. One should not say that the meat-eaters would be doing what is right in this case. Quite the contrary. What should be said is that Singer cannot argue that what they are doing is wrong by appeal to the impact of alternative diets on factory farming. Granted, the number of persons who are vegetarians does bear on the number of animals raised in factory farms, and granted, vegetarians must profoundly wish that their individual and collective efforts will ultimately reduce the number of animals so raised. Nevertheless, the obligation to be vegetarian cannot be grounded in these considerations, except at the price of the paradox Singer's view is heir to. How this obligation is to be grounded is explained and defended in 9.1. 6.5. Utilitarianism and Speciesism. Earlier in this chapter, it was observed that utilitarianism frequently is attacked on the grounds that it can sanction highly inequitable distributions of goods and evils. Since the end set by the theory is aggregative, requiring that we act to bring about the best balance of goods over evils for all affected by the outcome, critics argue that some individuals might be required to shoulder an inequitable share of the evils so that others may collectively maximize intrinsic goods. The challenge raised against both hedonistic and preference utilitarianism concerning the morality of killing is an example of this kind of objection. One individual is killed, and, as a consequence, optimal aggregate consequences are obtained, all considered. The survivors reap the benefits. The victim loses everything. The situation must strike us as radically unfair, and yet if the consequences, including the side effects, are optimific, the act utilitarian, the version of utilitarianism we have been concerned with throughout this chapter, must concede that his position is powerless to lodge a moral complaint. There are many other examples of act utilitarianisms allowing similar inequalities in treatment. For example, allowing that an innocent person might be punished to secure optimal results, all considered. We shall not rehearse all these objections again. Here it is relevant to note that a position like Singer's can allow the very thing it ostensibly rules out, namely, speciesism. On its face, utilitarianism seems to be the fairest, least prejudicial view around. Everyone's interests count, and no one's interests count for any more than the like interests of anyone else. The trouble is, as we have seen, there is no necessary connection, no pre-established harmony between everybody's abiding by the equality principle and everybody's having their interests forwarded equally. On the contrary, reliance on the principle of utility could sanction acting in ways where some individuals have their interests affected in significantly adverse ways. For example, they are killed because this brings about optimal aggregated results. Critics of utilitarianism argue that the utilitarian principle's potential for allowing an equitable distribution of goods and evils could even allow institutionalized injustices, such as racism and sexism, and that respect for the equality principle will not preclude this possibility. These prejudices can take different forms and find expression in different ways. One form would even deny the relevance of considering the interests of members of a given race or sex. Another would consider them, but not count their interests as equal in importance to the like interests of the members of the superior race or sex. Utilitarianism, with its reliance on the equality principle, assuming this reliance could be justified, would not sanction either of these views, and Singer powerfully denounces them. There is, however, a third form these prejudices might take. In this form, the interests of the members of the inferior race or sex are considered and are counted equitably. It just so happens that, all considered, the overall aggregated good is maximally promoted if we distribute goods in ways that favor the members of a particular race or sex, ways that are detrimental to those who belong to the inferior race or sex. Forms of racism or sexism, prejudices that seem to be ruled out by the utilitarians' reliance on the equality principle, could well be resurrected, and if the facts turn out a certain way, that is, if distributing goods and evils in ways that favor the superior over the inferior races or sexes did bring about the best consequences, all considered, would be justified. If the utilitarian were here to reply that distributing goods and evils in this way must violate the equality of interests principle, and so, on his view, would be forbidden, we must remind him that differential treatment is not the same as, and does not entail, violating that principle. Theoretically, it is quite possible, for example, to count the interests of blacks and whites the same, and thus to honor the equality principle, and still discriminate between the races when it comes to who gets what, the whites getting the lion's share of the goods and the blacks the leftovers, on the grounds that such discrimination in the distribution of goods promotes the utilitarian objective. Whether utilitarians can show that the facts are against this sort of thing ever being justified in the actual world is an open question at this point, one we will examine in a somewhat different context in the following chapter. The modest point being urged here is that, for all its emphasis on equality, utilitarianism would sanction recognizable forms of sexism and racism if the facts happen to turn out a certain way. The situation regarding speciesism is the same, only worse. As utilitarians, we must consider the interests of animals and count their interests equitably. Thus, certain kinds of speciesism, for example, one where we don't even regard the interests of animals as relevant, are ruled out. But respect for the equality principle is no guarantee that animals will be treated equitably, given the principle of utility, when it comes to distributive questions. That animals are raised intensively, for example, while human beings are not, provides no distinctively utilitarian argument against raising animals in this way. For it may be that treating animals in these ways brings about the best consequences, all considered, while comparable treatment of human beings would not. Theoretically, therefore, utilitarianism could provide a basis on which to defend recognizable speciesist practices. Whether it actually does must depend on whether the consequences of treating animals in these ways are better, all considered. Since Singer, for example, fails to provide us with the necessary empirical data showing that the consequences would be better, all considered, taking the interests of everyone involved into account if we cease to raise animals intensively, it follows that, for all we know, this treatment, which does reflect a kind of speciesism, as will be explained more fully later, might actually be justified, given a version of utilitarianism like Singer's. A position like his, all considered, is some distance from providing a foundation for genuine animal liberation. I shall return to this theme in the examination of rule utilitarianism. 6.6. Summary and Conclusion. In this chapter, we have examined representative direct duty views. Though far from complete, those views reviewed seem to hold the most promise of accounting for our direct duties to moral patients generally, and animals in particular, without relying on appeals to their rights. The cruelty-kindness view fails, it was argued, because it confuses considerations about the worth of moral agents with considerations about the morality of their acts, supposing that the mental states or dispositions of agents, their motives or intentions, determine the rightness or wrongness of what they do. Act utilitarianism, whether hedonistic or preference, avoids this confusion, but fails to provide an adequate basis for the stringency of the prima facie direct duty not to harm. Among the many problems any form of act utilitarianism must face, one in particular was highlighted, namely that of secret killings. Because of the secrecy of the killing, the side effects known killings give rise to, the anxiety and insecurity in the minds of the living, cannot be appealed to, and the act utilitarian is therefore forced to account for the immorality of secret killings independently of such considerations. Hedonistic utilitarianism fails in this regard because the pleasures lost by the victims can be more than made up for by the pleasures gained by the criminals, and preference utilitarianism is similarly unable to explain why such killings are wrong, since the loss of preference satisfaction on the part of the victims can again be more than compensated for by the gains of others, including the increased satisfactions of the criminals. A second major line of argument sought to show that both the cruelty-kindness view and the various forms of act utilitarianism examined would, if accepted, fail to provide the solid basis sought by those who labor for the better treatment of animals and those human moral patients like animals in the relevant respects. If, as the cruelty-kindness view supposes, our direct negative duties to these moral patients require only that we not be sadistically or brutally cruel to them, then persons who harm these individuals, but who feel empathy with or sympathy for them, would be above moral reproach. Their deeds could not be morally faulted. In the case of all those forms of utilitarianism examined, moreover, the harm done to these moral patients could not be morally criticized, so long as harming them was causally related to bringing about the optimal aggregate balance of good, for example, pleasure, over evil, for example, pain, for everyone affected by the outcome. a wheel of justification that is greased by the absence of foreboding anxiety in some cases, for example, infanticide and the slaughter of farm animals for food. Neither cruelty-kindness nor utilitarianism, therefore, provide a satisfactory basis for the direct duties we owe to these individuals. Utilitarianism frequently is applauded for its egalitarianism. Each is to count for one, no one for more than one. In this way, so its advocates assume, utilitarianism avoids the pernicious prejudices of sexism, racism, and speciesism. All this sounds very good indeed. The problem arises when we ask how the utilitarian obtains the principle rooted in this notion of equality and what status it can have within utilitarian theory. No utilitarian can regard it as obligatory to consider the interests, preferences, pleasures of those involved and count equal interests and the like equally, since this obligation will be either A, basic, underived, or B, non-basic, derived. If it is said to be the former, then utilitarianism is rendered inconsistent, since utility and utility alone is basic for utilitarians. If it is said to be the latter, then the notion of equality is distorted, since the equality or inequality of any two interests, or pleasures, etc., must depend on these pleasures or interests themselves, not on the utility of counting them as equal or unequal. Similarly deficient is the claim that the equality principle is a formal principle, since those who are not utilitarians can advance moral principles without first accepting the utilitarian interpretation of equality. At the very most, the equality principle, as understood by utilitarians, can be viewed as a conditional formal principle. If one wants others to give equal consideration to one's own interests, and if one takes the moral point of view, then, it may be alleged, one is committed to the consequentialist principle to act so as to further the interests of those affected by the outcome. However, even if we concede that one is committed to this principle, given the fulfillment of the conditions just sketched, it does not follow that one is committed to utilitarianism, the view that utility is the sole basis of morality, or that the principle one is committed to is a valid moral principle, or that this approach to identifying moral principles, starting with one's own desires, etc., is a valid approach. There are more questions that go begging than are answered when utilitarianism is argued for on the basis of accepting the conditional equality principle. Finally, Peter Singer's attempt to base the obligation to be vegetarian on utilitarianism was examined. It was noted that the equality principle, assuming it fits his preference utilitarianism, since it is a pre-distributive principle, is consistent with treating individuals radically different when it comes to deciding how to bring about the best aggregate balance of good over evil, which is a distributive concern. One cannot assume, therefore, that the equality principle is violated if people are willing to treat animals and relevantly similar human moral patients differently. As a utilitarian, Singer must acknowledge that questions about the differential treatment of various individuals, even those who are relevantly similar in terms of their interests, must depend on the consequences. In the particular case of the intensive rearing of farm animals, therefore, it is an open moral question for any utilitarian, Singer included, whether such treatment is wrong, and it cannot be assumed that the treatment these animals receive is wrong if those people who are willing to tolerate it are not willing to tolerate similar treatment of human moral patients who are like these animals in the relevant respects. For there is no reason why the consequences in the two cases must be the same, and it is consequences that, for any utilitarian, are morally decisive, assuming the equality principle has been satisfied. To show that, viewed from the perspective of preference utilitarianism, we have a moral obligation to be vegetarians, Singer must therefore show that the consequences for all concerned would be better if we were vegetarians than if we were not. Singer fails to show this for the simple reason that he fails to adduce the necessary empirical details. Moreover, despite his powerful denunciations of speciesism and sexism and racism, his position could sanction recognizable versions of these prejudices, It is not enough to count the equal interests of, say, pigs and children equally if we are to avoid speciesism. It is also essential that we treat both fairly after we have done this, something that is not guaranteed merely by respecting the equality principle. Finally, Singer's reply to the charge that, when viewed against his preference utilitarian position, an individual's deciding to be a vegetarian is a largely symbolic gesture, was shown to lead to the paradoxical consequence that meat-eaters can avoid the obligation to be vegetarian by the simple expedient of eating more meat. If the criticisms raised against Singer are fair and on target, neither those who seek a solid foundation for the obligation to be vegetarian nor those who seek a sound theory will find it in his preference utilitarianism.